Are you starting?
Yes, I am. Welcome, everybody. We're the Bevry community here, a platform for open collaboration and discussion over philosophical ideas and helping people in practice for their day-to-day lives, hopefully. I'm John Buck, today joined with Pleasure of Doubt, or Brett, as well as Craig Reed and also Nick from you guys seen him on this channel and also on Vanderklay's channel as well. And we might get Tyler coming in later as well. I think he's busy right now, but he might just pop in. So today we're discussing, let's see, lectures 43, 44, and 45 of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, which are
feels like
all
we're
about
rounding that like last lap. It doesn't of a really long race.
Yeah, I'm like not sure what I'm even going to be doing afterwards. Like once we finally finish it, what are we going to do? That's something that'll be interesting, is to try to think about like what are the takeaways from this series? Yeah. Like all 50 episodes we put in, how many weeks? Probably almost 30 weeks, maybe. I don't know. Into this series, and trying to think about like what are the things that we've taken away. I know I at least have taken on some of his vocabulary that he uses. Like psychotechnology is sort of like a very useful psychotechnology now to kind of express ideas.
Right. Yeah.
And I think
totally.
Yeah, and like some of his other ideas that like it's funny, he uses a lot of like Greek words in order to express these ideas, and it kind of sucks because then it's not very easy to explain to other people, because all you have is that kind of Greek word, and then you kind of have to elaborate. Like he uses anagoge quite regularly, and means that as some sort of
these lectures he really went overdrive into the Greek words with words I had never heard of even before with with the different types of wisdom in the Greek tradition. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. He kind of like laid out too many for us to like take on all of them at the same time. So I just kind of like tried to ignore those. But okay, so yeah, what we'll probably be doing, since for these lectures he was kind of like presenting the different scientific accounts for what wisdom is, and this is all like very recent work. It seems like all within probably the last 15-20 years. That he was going through, maybe even sooner than that. Like I know towards the end he actually lays out his own scientific account for wisdom that he has with another party, and he's actually in the lecture kind of criticizing some of the components to his own theory. It's like, what are you doing? So I think probably for this we'll do it in a sort of more laid back and casual format of just kind of laying out some of his ideas for like what are the different aspects to wisdom, and I don't know, kind of moving forward from there. We don't really need to go into all of the direct, like here's what this person lays out as a theory, and then here's where it sort of falls, or it falls short of the mark through these other people. We'll probably be taking a more kind of broad and abstract approach to what he laid out during these lectures. I don't know. Each of us can probably kind of lay out put forward any like main takeaways that we had, and if we need to, we can kind of get into some of the stuff that he goes over during the lectures.
I thought it was interesting in the Schwartz and Sharp, which is the first I guess couple they talked about their research, where he was really talking about we're talking about virtue, and that it's not enough to just say we should be virtuous. We should just follow the virtues anytime we can, because virtues often conflict, and a lot of the time it's about figuring out when you should be applying which virtue to which extent, and there can be conflict between virtue, like honesty. If you're always honest, if you say I have to be honest no matter what, you can be often cruel. You go up to somebody who say, hey, you look fat in that, you look terrible today. Yeah, why are you such an idiot? Being honest is not always.
I'm just being honest.
I mean, just being honest, but it can lead to a lot of trouble. Then there's the virtue of being kind. So they can, we have to figure out, when do you want to be honest? When do you want to be kind? When do you want to be helpful? And they can. It's about balancing these virtues and not just saying, I'm going to be extremely virtuous in any one virtue, because that leads to pretty terrible situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember hearing this podcast from a Platonist. I think he was talking to Dr. Alex Malpass, a philosopher, and he was kind of laying out the Platonic critique of Aristotelian conception of like the good. It is that within Aristotle, you have all these like I think 9 different virtues, and each of them are kind of like good in and of themselves. But there's no unifying factor that you can have
Right.
to kind of like compare these against each other, because there might be instances where you could be courageous in one instance, but that it would also mean being dishonest in another sense. And so like, how do you compare those two against each other if they're these unique things in and of themselves? And so by having some sort of broader or not context, but broader unifier of all these virtues into something that singular, then that kind of allows you to go through and figure out which one to apply in this given situation. And it seems like he's kind of laying that out as wisdom is the unifying factor between each of these virtues, and like finding out what is sort of, I guess, the golden mean for this specific context and which to apply it.
Well, that's it, because it's always context specific. I mean, you can't just have one rule that just applies in every context. You have to have a rule that helps you figure out what to do in each context. And I guess that's being wise. The better you can do that, the more wise you are. And it's that perspectival knowing, just being in the position to analyze the context and know just how much honesty should you have, in any one situation, or when does being kind, a lot of conservatives would say, for example, that liberals, focus on being kind, but they do it to a fault where it starts hurting the people they're trying to help, and vice versa.
Right.
The liberals would say the same about the conservatives. So
Right.
each has the view that, but it's interesting because each is actually looking for the good, but each thinks the other is doing the good in a bad way.
It's interesting. I was watching a video earlier. It was a clip from a conversation between Jonathan Peugeot and I think it was Friar Stephen something. Can't remember. But they ended up bringing this up in the conversation, which was basically, agree or disagree. Their argument was one of the main reasons for contextualizing religion in a story is that it gives you this dynamic way to apply virtue. And they compared it to the secular frames that have arisen, where it's quite clear that virtue is not gone from these frames, but what seems to happen is that they go wildly out of control. So, right, again, using the far left as an example, it's not that it's not virtuous, it's that it's too virtuous in many ways, and that these virtues
you can kill people with kindness.
Yeah, they've lost the balance to be able to create a golden mean within their philosophy.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I think I might be able to get what you're saying, because like I was just thinking, like even though like religion has a narrative, like even within the secular culture, there is a type of narrative that is being applied, but it might be the sort of ideological type of narrative that Peterson points out that has all of the good side and like we're all the good and that's all the bad things, where it's looking at things from a very binary sort of lens. Whereas I know Peterson lays out like for religions that it's much more, I guess, complex, in that the character of Adam is both the first man, but he's also sinful, and same for like all the other patriarchs within the Old Testament. There is some sort of aspect to them that is both someone who walks with God, but also they falter and they fail in their walkings.
Even with Christ, right? You often see him. He's not condensed into one mode of behavior. It's instead this extremely complex and broad-ranged set of behaviors that are constantly changing given the situation. So it becomes really hard to just blatantly blatantly codify it as
Like, it
here's the
doesn't make-
virtues.
Yeah,
follow
it doesn't
them,
make much
you know?
sense to like label him as the communistic kind of hippie lovey-dovey guy when there's other verses where he explicitly calls a Gentile woman a dog because she's of a different race from the Jews, and like there's and sort of his aggressive nature that he has towards like very, very much like think that I did not come to bring peace but a sword or something like that. And
Turn
that might be
daughters against mothers and
Yeah.
Or he's
against
beating
fathers.
the money, beating.
well, the communists like that aspect of him, I'm sure.
It's just that, anytime you have an extreme, you're unlikely to be having an optimal, the optimal grip on the situation. I mean, that's the whole thing with extremes. Extremes can be useful to bring about some change when change is needed, but then you've got to sort of bring it back a little bit, like bringing attention to an issue, whether it's bringing getting rid of slavery, bringing the vote, some radicalism often can be useful, but that radicalism, if it doesn't give way to sort of a more centrist practical philosophy, or political philosophy, you're gonna run into trouble.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Hegel, but it might be something sort of like that, where you have the thesis and the antitheses, where if you have these like political groups, or not even political groups, but any sort of idea that isn't able to synthesize into some sort of composition, or like taking aspects from both, then there will be sort of that, like, this one just has to kill the other one, in a metaphorical sense or in a literal sense.
Well, look at the Me Too movement, for example. I mean, the Me Too movement, I think, is a reaction to a very real problem, which was that a lot of people, a lot of particularly men, were getting away with doing a lot of bad stuff to women without virtually any consequence, whether socially or legally. And in turn, that movement to some extent has overcorrected perhaps a bit. Over in that certain people are getting caught up in it that maybe shouldn't. And that's unfortunate.
And they've also started the thing where the meme where you believe a woman no matter what. Well, that's really not fair. She could easily be lying. But they say, no, you believe the woman no matter what. As a form of overcorrection, that was actually kind of necessary, because originally you didn't believe the woman at all, because the man was powerful and there was an interest at stake. So
society sometimes has to go a little bit too far, and then I think it settles back in. I think that's what we're seeing with the Me Too. I mean, then you have things like trust but verify, which is sort of the compromise position. Take it seriously when someone claims they've been assaulted. You take it seriously, but you don't just condemn the alleged perpetrator instantly. You do your due diligence, but we take it a lot more seriously than often women were laughed at when they went to a police station and reported a crime, and there were all sorts of social conventions which led women not to report. A big part of society was saying you're not going to be taken seriously if you report these things that are being done to you, and that was a problem that has to be fixed, and hopefully we'll end up with something that's a little more neutral, and just the women feel that they can report, but people aren't being just torn down just on an allegation.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, like just trying to think of it almost like this transit, or almost like an evolving of salience I wonder if it almost like needs that extreme aspect just so that this becomes hyper salient, and then once it's hyper salient, then we can recognize that, okay, that's too much. Now we got to focus on these other things that we've been neglecting now, and so these sort of rise up in hyper salience in some sense.
Well, the point of like the people who push that stuff is they always say the personal is political, and if you're not extreme, the status quo wins out. So the status quo is to overlook what's happening. The reason why it happened is men had the power in the social contract, all the power in the situation. So if the woman was getting harassed by the man, it's just overlooked. That guy's great, and in order for it to be noticed, the idea, and there's the idea in feminist theory, is that you have to make the personal political and be extreme. in order to upend the power structure altogether. So you have to constantly be, that's why it's kind of gone down the way it's gone down socially.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if that was clear how I said it.
Well, Nassim Taleb in his book Skin in the Game, he lays out this minority rule sort of like principle where if you have 10% of people that are exclusive, so that they're only going to be able to say you have some sort of product that's shared between the entire market, and then you have 10% of people that will only accept the product in a certain way, and then the rest of the 90% of people can take it that certain way or take it the regular way. In order to apply or in order to make the product viable for that 10%, it's going to change, and the rest of the 90% will just have to sort of deal with it, because it's the 10% that are being hyper exclusionary that's sort of setting the market trends for everybody else. And he lays out a couple examples in the books, but it's a really interesting kind of concept to see in practice in other areas as well. Like he explicitly ties it to how morality shifts, because you have certain people that are exclusive in this one domain, and then
because there's certain people, exactly, because they prioritize that. They prioritize that idea all the time.
Yeah,
so
because it's hyper salient to them,
and everybody else is kind of like, okay,
they'll just go along with it.
Exactly. It's exactly how radicalism works. Exactly why it takes root in society and they get places. And it's also why we pay more attention to, the loudmouths on Twitter than other people. It's the same principle. They make themselves hyper salient because their squeaky wheel gets the grease in larger context. Right?
Yeah. Going back a bit into, I guess, his explanation of wisdom, there's something that kind of stood out to me of like where some of these different theories that he was laying out were, and kind of like what you were saying earlier, I think, Brett, that that wisdom is too much, like their account of wisdom is too much in the sort of propositional understanding, and not as much in the perspectival or the participatory notion of having wisdom, really, and being able to be wise, where like you can have an account of like what wisdom is, what are the instances of people with wisdom and all that, but that doesn't, like, even with all of that doesn't make you a wise person. Like you have to be somebody who exhibits wise behaviors in a sort of way, or you have to embody wisdom in a lot of ways.
Well, see, I was wondering about this. Like, is there really a conflict between somebody knowing what the right thing to do is, but still not doing it? Like, would we still say can we say that they're wise in the sense that they know what they should do, or they know what the right thing to do, or they could give advice to do it, but still not do it? Can we, are there different degree? Would we say it's just a different degree of wisdom, that you're more wise if you do it, or are you not wise if you don't do it, if you only know it?
Yes, wisdom.
You don't do it.
No.
Like I've always prior to this always kind of
wisdom
taken wisdom
implies
as
like a third element. It isn't just knowledge.
You're kind of cutting out, Craig. Can't quite hear you. Might have lost him.
I think we've lost.
Who?
Oh no, Craig, you're breaking up. We haven't heard most of what you've been saying.
I'm not talking.
Well, you were saying something earlier though, and we missed that.
Just start again.
Oh wait, okay. I was gonna. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Wisdom implies like you. It's deeper than knowledge. Knowledge is you know things. Wisdom is you can put that knowledge into application. So there's a lot more going on. Like you have agency over yourself. You know yourself. That's the most important thing in wisdom. So you can like being a smart salesman is knowing the thing, is no rope. But being understanding people, understanding yourself, And it's a really, really complex thing of a whole bunch of different things that you can put into application.
Right.
Not sure if that was clear.
I remember in one of his much earlier lectures, he was kind of going, I think it was
Can you
the
hear
one
me?
on, yeah, we can hear you. When he was going into Aristotle, he was saying that the person who
Okay.
knows how to make a chair, and then the person who can make a chair, the person that can make the chair actually has a higher degree of understanding for what a chair is, because they have that power to make the chair, their conception of a chair, into a reality. And I kind of see wisdom as that, is very much like the ability to apply your knowledge into what is good, really, and to know what is good, and also to be able to act upon it.
But it's interesting, like we say someone like Socrates, for example, is wise based on the things he said. We don't know if he did any of those things, and we don't know if he carried anything out, right? And look, he wound up dead. You know, so we,
Right.
most people say, Socrates was wise, one of the wisest, but what we have is the knowledge, the way of going through the Socratic method, the way of working through issues. And so, and presumably, if he did follow through with that, that would be good. But let's just say he never did anything but have those conversations. He never put anything into practice. Would we say that changes how wise we think he is? I don't know. Like I get how enacting it is a better step. Like the guy who knows how to make a chair versus the guy who actually can make it is a higher step. But I don't know that we would say, like, we wouldn't say the guy who knows how to make the chair is not knowledgeable. We just say the guy who can participatorily do it is more knowledgeable than the guy who only knows it theoretically.
Well, also recall, like, the reason Socrates was called the wisest man in Athens is because he particularly knew that which he did not know, whereas everybody else in Athens pretended to know things, but all it took was a few direct questionings from Socrates himself in order for them to sort of realize that what they thought they knew, they didn't actually know. They were just kind of taking it on this, and maybe that's the aspect of, at least, like, Socrates as laid out by Plato in the dialogues, is Socrates has the ability to figure out what is kind of the thing underneath there, and then figure out what are the problems with that, and then from there sort of like be able to conceptualize sort of a resolution to those things.
But see, all of those are not participatory. It's interesting. All of those are in the conceptual. I mean, it can be in the serious play aspect, in the, it could be like, he may be able to, like, if I can put myself in the shoes of someone doing something, Socrates could put himself in the shoes of the other person and work through these problems. But none of it involves, actually going out and doing it. We don't know. We have no knowledge about what, I don't know, maybe historians.
It may be that his application of wisdom was purely in a conversational sense, whereas most applications of wisdom are much more, I guess, salient than that, or real than that. Like, one thing that I think about, or sorry, Craig, were you going to say something?
Yeah, the famous part with Socrates is that the guy says that he's the wisest person who ever lived, and he goes, I can't be, because I don't really know anything at all. And then so he sees himself as really not wise at all, really totally unlearned. And that's where the wisdom, that's what they say is what makes him wise. Because then he goes and talks, well, these people got to be smarter than me. And then when he starts talking to these people and he uses the Socratic method, they're totally dumbasses. They don't know anything. So he's at least got one leg up on everybody else, in that he's humble enough to see how ignorant reading those, and that's a huge chunk of it.
Don't you get the sense reading those that there's a bit of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink? They're supposed to be wise. I always read in some sarcasm there. They're supposed to be wise, but let's see what happens when I talk to them. It all falls apart.
I mean, he was killed by his friends.
The point is they're not wise at all, and Socrates has the self-knowledge to understand. And if you use that self-knowledge, you will automatically be wiser than everybody else, because almost nobody uses it. That's what I think the point is. Nobody's critical of themselves. It puts you miles ahead of the competition.
So
Always.
the
Because-
sense,
Go ahead, Lou.
Self-awareness.
the sense that I'm getting
humility.
is that wisdom is largely revolving around the frame in which someone's knowledge is operating. So when we get the sense that a person has a more accurate frame or context, we associate that more strongly with wisdom. And so that's seemingly what is being talked about with Socrates here, which is
Sounds-
that his context of the domain in which knowledge and rationale is functioning, he had a much better grasp of that domain than the people that were assuming their knowledge. Right?
I mean, it seems like there's the other component to wisdom that doesn't even have to do with accuracy. I think it just has to do with like having some sort of heuristic that allows you to act upon what you know to be true. This is kind of silly, but there's William James who suffered from depression for a large part of his life, but through kind of his principles of positive psychology managed to, I guess, like kind of work through that in a sort of way. And that's kind of the I don't know, some sort of a joke that you might think of, like where if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? Since you like a lot of people are like big brained and being able to like know a lot of things, but they're also like miserable in a lot of ways as well. And so like there's a second component there. Like it's not just about having some sort of accurate models for reality. It's being able to apply some sort of behavior or maybe even some just like a mental tool in order to work with those models in a way that's fruitful for yourself and others.
That's what I was trying
Right.
to say with context. I would say as opposed to content. So there's no model in context, right? It's not yet at the stage of proposition. Once you know the space that you're building in, you now have right model constraints and things like that that help you shape your knowledge into a functional model. But I would not say that context and this kind of framing issue is meant in the sense of modeling the world. It has aspects of it, but
I
right,
think
knowing what you don't know is not a model.
right.
It's the empty space. You're highlighting the empty space that the model is functioning in.
I think for myself, like a better archetype for wisdom that I have more so than Socrates is probably Solomon, who's definitely ascribed a great deal of wisdom. And it's not just wisdom in like conversational ability, but also being able to like make decisions. Like there's the whole story about the two women that had children. One of them rolled over in her sleep and killed the child. And then that woman switched out the children with the other mother. And then there's this dispute. The one woman says that this child is hers, and the other woman killed her child, and then the other woman saying the exact opposite. And so like Solomon has to figure out, okay, how do you resolve this issue? And so his solution is like, okay, give me the baby, I will cut it in half, and each of you get your half of the child. Right. And then the real mother's like, no, don't cut my baby in half. Let her take it. That's fine. I would rather him live.
I would hope both mothers would have said that. Both women would have said that.
Well, if the one mother like was careless enough to,
she was like, yeah, cut it half. The other one's like, yeah, cut it half. I want my half.
Yeah.
But someone might say, no, okay, I've taken this too far. Let her keep her baby. I don't want to kill another baby. I've killed one already.
But I think that's kind of like a stereotype, or not stereotype, but a commonality to wisdom is where there are these insoluble problems, they come up with it. They have some sort of insight to resolve it.
That's the right. But that's the whole point of a Zen koan, where they ask you the insolvable problem, and there isn't really an answer, but as you meditate and as you grow with the problem and you humble yourself, the wise path emerges organically. That's what wisdom is. It's finding It's finding the disparity between, but basically between polarized opposites where there is no real answer. The wise person can find the answer. That's the whole point of a Zen koan, that you contemplate the unsolvable problem, and that's where wisdom. So yes,
Yeah.
Does a dog have a Buddha
I was
nature?
going to say,
Woof.
The only one I know of is what is the sound of one hand clapping? You're like,
did you ever see The Simpsons where he's like Lisa, and he's pushing his hand? I can't do it on. You have to see what I'm doing, but he's like Lisa. He's like making his fingers clap. Look, come on, Lisa.
Here we go. That's the sound of one hand clapping.
Yes, that. Yes. He's like, no, Lisa, come on.
Yeah.
Well, I guess
So
it's not-
on this,
oh, yeah, go
can
ahead.
there's a YouTube video I saw last night that's related to what John was just talking about with the Solomon, King Solomon, where this guy puts a $100 bill prior to a person sitting down on a bench right beneath their feet. And he goes, oh, look, I found a $100 bill. And the person goes, oh, wait, I dropped that. Like he planted it there. And you see him plant it there. And then this girl's like, no, I that fell out of my wallet. He's like, you sure that fell out of your wallet? She's like, yeah, look. And she opens it, yeah, I'm sure. I had $105 and that's the $100 bill. And one guy actually started beating him up. He's like, yo, that's my money. He started punching.
That's funny.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead, Brett.
Well, no, I was going to say, like we talked about Greek words, but Vervaeke gives us Aristotle's distinctions between Sophia, which is theoretical wisdom, and then phronesis. I don't know, phronesis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, which is practical wisdom. So, I think it is useful to talk about these different types, and maybe this is what we've been talking about, that there's different types of wisdom. You can have the theoretical wisdom, and then there's practical wisdom.
And he connects the theoretical to principles, and then the practical to processes. And so like you need to have like certain principles, like what would be I guess a wise principle to uphold,
Like be kind. I think
well,
was the example he gave.
Yeah, that would be like a certain principle that you could take up that would be sort of applicable between virtues. And then there's the other component of processes. Like, okay, how do I be kind? Well, if I see the Buddha nature within the other person, that is a psychotechnology that I can use to fulfill the principle of being kind. And then you can kind of work those between each other as well for other things as well besides that. And I think that's kind of the key thing to wisdom is having the psychotechnologies or the meta heuristics that he points out in order to fulfill the thing that you're trying to fulfill.
And the thing is, because it's so context sensitive, you can't create firm rules for how to carry all this out, or else you're going to be, it's just combinatorially explosive. You're going to have rules for every single context. And this is how he brings in, like always, relevance realization, because it's always, it's a self-referential. It's evolving. It's transjective, and it's not about, but on the other hand, you don't want to have no rules. You don't want to have anarchy, or
that goes back.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That goes back to what? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Craig.
No, it's you.
That goes back to what you started on when you were talking about virtue. Like I'm pretty sure that a categorical imperative where it was like a hard, fast rule of morality that never changes. So like you never lie. And then the obvious weakness of that is like, okay, the proverbial, the Jews and the Nazi soldier comes to the door. You never lie. It's wrong, but in that context, it's totally right. So there's always like, in trying to find a hard, fast rule of a moral thing or an action is in itself probably not wise, because there's always like, it's understanding a whole complexity of situations and being able to apply it most successfully more like an art than a science, right?
But yeah, but he's also pointing out that like you can't just lay all of this onto the legal structures, like, because you, even with a hyper civilized and sophisticated legal system, like, it's not going to be able to have all of these, I don't want to just say nuances, but like dynamic components that are out there, where you have to actually, like, there's certain instances where you do have to be a bit brutally honest to the other person because they've been sort of like going down this bad path, and you realize, okay, people have been too nice to them, and so somebody needs to kind of sit them down on their butt and tell them what's up.
Tell them what's up.
Yeah.
You know, you look fat in those jeans, girl. Don't wear.
But and then you have like you have the people.
Tell them what's up.
Then you have the people online who thinks they should always just use what they call tough love, and they're just jerks to everybody, and you know, at all times, and it creates resentment, and it works against them. So again, it's about finding when, like, tough love's it's tough to figure out when you should apply tough love, because you can apply it in a very reckless way. I mean, you know, for example, if somebody has a phobia, just saying snap out of it, or you know, you need to, like, that's the wrong approach. That is not going to help somebody. You know, like forcing them to do something. Psychologists will say, in order to get somebody to get over a phobia, they have to voluntarily accept it. So if you come in hard on somebody like that, you're just going to make them feel like crap and not help them at all. It's it's all about figuring out when to do it, and there's no one way. So do we call it? But so would we call it? But I'm still calling it objective in a way. Like, you can objectively figure out the right balance that is the optimal balance. So I don't think it just makes it subjective just because there's no hard and fast rule. But we can argue about where that balance is, where the right amount.
Yeah, that's the thing with Kant. It's like entirely propositional. Like, Kant bases his entire ethics within the rational. Like, I have this rational principle, and then from there I can kind of develop everything else off of that. And that is that is like completely removing yourself from the perspectival and, in a sense, the participatory. And I mean, you're still the one like enacting the principles, but there is still the problem of, like, certain contexts that you're within will demand a certain principle that won't be applicable universally. And so
right, and it could still be true in the Kantian way. Like, there still could be hard, fast rules, but they'd have to be a lot more complicated. Like, there's a priority that, so like, you lie when the Jews are in the basement and the Nazi comes to the door, you lie. So there's obviously a moral rule that's overriding the don't lie. You know what I'm saying? You lie in that situation. It could still be rules and it could still be objective. It's just 1,000 times more complex, and it's situational. But there still could be kind of hard, fast rules. That's what physics is all about. You know, these really particular rules that are really, really complex down in, you know, micro situations, right? I think that made sense. Go ahead.
I know Vervaeke, like, if you were to sort of like take on some sort of categorical imperative, the categorical imperative would be relevant. And then that is a universalizable rule. But it's something that is like telling you to be relevant in each of the specific contexts.
Not in the Kim Kardashian way.
Yeah.
I'm totally in the Kim Kardashian way. What do you mean? She makes a lot of money. Then you can worry about, like, being scientific.
Yeah, that's right.
What are you gonna say, Nick?
One thing that seemed, at least to my mind, kind of missing from what he was talking about was usually when we hear stories of a person that has developed wisdom, it is through extremely participatory means that they have come across wisdom. Right? It has almost nothing to do with the intellect in that sense. So, right, you can see it in, say, the story of the Buddha with the shocking reveal to the evils of the world, and then followed by then an extreme movement out of the world through asceticism. And right, the wisdom develops through the dynamic play of going to the extremes. And I wonder then if wisdom has something very intimately to do with a willingness to go to extremes in order to actually, and in some sense, figure out what the frame actually is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, while he goes sort of over all these different theories of wisdom, he like hardly really touches on how to cultivate wisdom. And if it's the case that, like in the Buddha's example, like in order to cultivate a specific wisdom about like the things of this world are transitory and not worth hanging on to, not worth investing all your time on, then this would be something that in order to reach that type of wisdom, you have to put yourself into this sort of like system of practices, or like in a specific environment that is conducive to that
and the wrong
wise
principle
coming forward.
That's the other part.
Yeah.
Right. Wisdom is developed from doing the wrong things much more so than it is doing the right things, or doing the right things in the wrong way.
That's William Blake.
If the fool would persist.
The path of ascents to the palace.
You're cutting out, Craig. What's William Blake?
Oh, fool will persist in his folly, he will become. If the fool will persist in his folly, he will become wise. Yeah, that's also isn't that Proverbs of Hell too, William Blake?
Yep.
And yeah, am I cutting out still? The path of
no, yeah. We can hear you.
But I get the sense that that's a different type of a different type of wisdom, like the wisdom of just learning from your mistakes. I mean, it's just that was bad. Now I know that's bad. Let's not do that again. I mean, in a way, that's wisdom, but it doesn't seem to be wisdom in the way that he's talking about.
I do not think that is a fair account of how people learn from extreme circumstances in their life. I don't think, well, for some, it just operates at the level of that was bad, don't do it again. But most will develop a far more robust strategy. That's why generally, right, it helps a lot more to go to someone for help that has healed from the problem you're trying to solve than going to a learned person. The learned person has almost nothing to offer you compared to the person that has been in your circumstance and has learned the way out of it.
Well, this is what I was wondering, because the experiential approach to wisdom, I mean, the people we associate with wisdom traditions, like monks, who they may have certain experiences, but they don't have most of the experiences that the average person has. So
in a sense,
they apply their wisdom to the average person.
In a sense, they do, since they're being like, every time something bad is happening to somebody, they're going to the monk to try to get some sort of wisdom. And so if the monk is interacting with all these people that bad things are happening or good things are happening, and they can see maybe from that abstract out some sort of pattern.
I guess it depends how isolated
what works.
The monk is. I guess there are probably some monks who administer to people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the point of a monk like you're talking about would be that he would either in Christian or Buddhist tradition, he's outside of the play of life, so he can see. He can actually see. Everybody else is caught up in the drama itself, so they're not going to be wise. That's what like a monkish tradition teaches you to see what's really important, because you're not caught up in the day-to-day of like making money and being the biggest big status person and stuff. That's the implication of the monk. That's totally different than the Blakean thing that the first thing is kind of like you said. It was like wisdom of you find out not to do it. It was more like, right, it's more like a transcendent wisdom, like the path of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. It's like you become like a seer. You become like this kind of like cool badass, like a Jim Morrison. Now you're like, you see through it, man, because you see this other side of life now. That's the other one. They're two different things though. The monk would be like, he's wise because he doesn't have the same attachments. In Christianity or Buddhism, actually, be the same idea.
It's funny. I'm reading through Aristotle's Ethics right now, and he's going into like wisdom. And one of the things he kind of points out is like the he's kind of like advising against teaching young people why wisdom ethics, because none of the young people have any sort of experience that they can draw from in order to actually understand these things. They're just going to like take the principle and then just sort of run with it. They don't have the all the back history of knowledge of like when this principle will actually apply or not. But
well, that's, I was thinking that too, that we start off by teaching kids just do as I say, right? I mean, we can try to give them reasons, but you know, when we try to teach them virtues, we don't tend to put them through some litmus test of trial by fire. We say, you know, don't do this, do that. You know,
right? Just because I say so.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Why? Because I said so.
Well, and I think that what we are doing there is we are trying to actually restrain the exploration by which they will find those principles to be true. Right? It doesn't stop at just listen to what I say. It's right. In some sense, we say, listen to what I say. And that hopefully is enough such that when they don't do what we said, the wrong that is induced by it is enough to enforce the principle, but not enough to truly damage them.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell my kids, you know, when they've hurt the other, how do you think that feels? How do you think it feels to be in his situation or her situation? Trying to get them to get into that participatory, perspectival, you know, frame. You know, frame. Then it eventually comes down to just do it.
At least you took the higher path first, and then you went down the lower. Eventually, they'll get there.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So, do we want to talk about expertise? Is not necessarily the same as wisdom, or is that? I think it's pretty.
That's pretty obvious.
Or,
yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
I noticed you had like a couple questions or like notes in there. Let's see. There's one of them that I know you explicitly wrote out. Like, I'm not sure I understand this. And that was something else that I was kind of like having trouble working through. Oh, it was the meaning to life thing, I think.
Yeah. Let me find it in my notes. Just for anyone who's watching, there's a link to my notes where I take notes, and sometimes I put little, if I have time, when I'm not doing it, like trying to listen literally an hour before we go on air. So I'll put little thoughts. One note I have: he's not saying he doesn't consider himself wise, just that he didn't apply that statement. He's where he says, you know, knowledge of wisdom doesn't make somebody wise, and he says, I don't apply that to myself too. Just because I have a lot of knowledge, that doesn't equate to claiming to be wise. Now, he didn't say he's not. He doesn't also think he's wise.
Well, it's interesting. It kind of made me like think about it. Like, is wise a property that you can never ascribe to yourself? It can only be ascribed to you by other people. Like I guess that might be a transjective property in some ways. Because like, like he had brought up a couple
once
lectures.
You ascribe it to yourself, you aren't.
Yeah. He draws that exact point that like it's an act of what is the term he uses? Perspectival contradiction. No, it's something different, but it's like some sort of like contradiction when referencing yourself, in the same way that saying I'm asleep right now would be a contradiction, but like by me saying I'm wise.
He did talk about that.
And
you can't be, because a wise person would never say that. A wise person would never ascribe that to themselves. He did, and
we could say oh, sorry, Craig, go ahead.
No, I'm good.
Oh,
I think
okay. I was we could say that part of being wise is recognizing your lack of wisdom, right? Yes. You can also say the same about being smart, right? Part of being smart
seems
is
like
actually
a paradox.
knowing how little you actually know, right?
Yeah.
Because you're able to actually see all the variables that you can't keep track of, or at least, right? That's the Dunning-Kruger,
Yeah, I was
the
just
flip
thinking.
side of Dunning-Kruger.
Yes,
well,
totally.
But I think there can be nuance here. You can recognize when you've said something that's, hey, that's kind of bang on. Well, you can also recognize, yeah, but in all these other ways, I'm really not bang on.
Yeah.
You know, you can recognize that, hey, I was pretty good with that, but I'm not a sage. Like I haven't just figured everything out. And you should just, people should just follow me. Because, just because you have a few nuggets of, people can have nuggets of wisdom and still be total messes in other areas of their lives.
Absolutely.
I found the passage. It was about, he was talking. So he said he was talking about, he's talking about the personality characteristics of the wise person. He went through the cognitive, reflective, and affective personality characteristics. So he's talking about, in the affective part, he was talking about compassion, agape, and overcoming egocentrism. And he says that, so he said, I don't know if I took it down exactly right, but he said, agape gives a way of talking about meaning in life. We get that kind of connectedness and caring which grounds meaning in life. We have to be transjectively coupled to those things we find inherently valuable because of their connection to meaning-making coherence. And I just wrote, I'm not sure I understood that.
Well, I remember this was kind of our point of contention maybe a couple episodes ago in regards to objective value, which we talked about with Craig with the Elvis Presley's guitar example. So I don't want to go too far into it, but I know in
awesome.
this, he was directly connecting it between like, instead of, say, the Aristotelian notion where we're automatically driven towards the good, whatever the good is, that the good doesn't have to be this objective thing like gravity that's pulling us towards it. It can instead be this, and this is where it almost seems like he's fudging a bit, this transjective thing that, transjectively coupled to what we find inherently valuable because of their connection to meaning-making, coherence, and caring. And I don't know, it seems like he's hiding a bit there. Because for one, it's like something that's inherently valuable, or what we're finding inherently valuable, but it's not objectively valuable. I'm not seeing the distinction really there between those things. I recognize like he's saying that but it's not entirely subjectively based, because he's trying to get away from that that way of thinking about meaning, and he's also wanting to get away from the objective thinking about meaning. But I'm not sure his transjective like works exactly in that way.
And I'm not sure why he focuses just on agape, because like what I think I realized that is that agape without philia, without the brotherly love type aspect, can become completely
inappropriate, I would say.
Yeah, where I was gonna say like totalitarian. If you take too far the I want what's good for you and I know what's good for you and I want to impart this, it becomes totalitarian. Like, this is what's good for you.
Takes away their autonomy.
Yeah, I'm the father to the child, and I am going to impose what is good for you because I love you so much.
Right.
And so without the brotherly love of seeing each other's points of view and putting yourself in the other person's perspective, because putting yourself in the other person's perspective is more, what would that be, more erotic? It's like more consuming, your or would that be agape? That would be more, I see it more as filial, putting yourself in
I think that would probably be the because filial is like just reciprocal relationship sort of thing, right?
Yeah. So I think like agape is very important, but he even said in I think 45, I'm focusing on agape more than filial and presumably eros, which he didn't really say. But they're all there. They're all important. And, you don't have society without filial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm having a hard time seeing his connection between agape and wisdom itself. I guess it's connected to the meaning-making apparatus. Because that's the thing, like if wisdom is tied to like what we find relevant, and what we find relevant is what is meaningful to us, then you sort of, I guess, have to connect the agape, since I guess his understanding of agape is that which makes meaning. So this, the relevance realization machine produces meaning within people, and so that's how it's agape, because it's making meaning, literally.
Well, no, I thought agape in his terms was that the means by which agency is granted, right? It's the loving
Like personhood.
personhood. Yeah.
But literally in the way of raising a child, though. Like,
Well,
I don't think so.
he
Again,
sees
I think
relevancy
there's a
realization as that thing that brings about agency or personhood into a person, or from a
yeah.
no,
Sure.
but like I raise my children. I'm literally helping them become people.
Yeah, but again, there's a reason that agape, and this goes back to your earlier criticism just a moment ago. Agape gets split off from Storge, is specifically to keep agape from taking on that authoritarian function.
What is Storge?
That is the love of a parent for a child.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, he didn't really bring in Storge, so I've always considered love of a parent to child to be part of agape, but is it?
I
mean, it's one major characteristic of the love that a parent has for a child, but I do not think that it's. I think when we start conflating it with how we go about parenting, that's where it gets out of. It starts diverging.
Like Andrew's Stratalities, actually, in that discussion that we had with him, he was. I don't think he used the word storge, but to draw the distinction between agape and the parental love is that there's a way in which your parental love can be overbearing and sort of like a Freudian sort of overbearing mother or something like that, where you're keeping the thing as this, I don't know, underling to you, and you're not allowing them to grow out of that into something more.
Yeah.
Or yes, I think of it honestly, like I've seen Christians, for example, online who say they love people, they love, for example, atheists, and so they just want to do anything they can to converse them, and just, but it becomes very oppressive, the way some people go about it. They just want to impose this sort of view in good faith. I mean, they want to save them from going to hell, but it can be a very top-down style of condescending at times, and
I don't think it's like that useful either, because like when you're interacting with somebody and you know that they have some sort of like explicit goal, like it's almost like they're using you as a means to an end rather than like interacting with you as an end unto themselves, which I know it's hard to do that, because like we always have our sort of goals that we're trying to kind of get out of these things, but when you know that it's so explicit like that, it's hard to really trust people that are
you can't trust the things they're saying to you, because you know that it's a means to an end, and they're trying to actually close the sale, basically. So anything they say is like, all right, well, he's just saying that to close the deal. It's not something organic to the moment that you're going to take notice of. It's like it's very similar to a salesman. When the salesman, you don't trust anything the salesman tells you about the product, because they're trying to close the deal. If you know the person's trying to convert you, you're not going to necessarily trust anything they say about, if they're too explicitly trying to convert you with the things they say. You're like, okay, well, you're saying this to win. It's too out.
And I would say that
you gotta be subtle, right? Pleasure, doubt.
Yep.
And I would say it would be a very deep shame to describe that type of loving as agapic. In my experience, that is not what it is at all. But sure, and I'm saying that's a deep shame. I don't care if they do; they're wrong.
I'm not entirely certain that happens in good faith, to tell you the truth.
Well,
I know you're ascribing good faith to it, but
if
I don't
you
think it's
really
for your
believe,
benefit.
but if you
I don't think it's for your benefit, though.
if you really believe that people who are not saved are going to suffer torment for eternity, then I can imagine being desperate to convert people, because I would really want them not to suffer for eternity and be tormented for eternity. So I don't think all of them are in good faith. I get some of them are just doing it as a sort of a virtue signal type thing. But I think for some people, they really desperately want to save people because they're horrified by the fact of people going to hell.
And I would say, I did not mean to say that what they're experiencing is not a form of love. I just specifically would consider it a shame to consider it agapic love. I think Storge love would be far more descriptive of what is taking place there than agape would. And that's just from my experience of agapic love. It really has it doesn't have a preconceived notion at all. And yet through experiencing it, it transforms you fundamentally, right? In the sense that Vervaeke was describing wisdom, it reshapes your taste fundamentally. You don't have to tell the person what they should or should not do, because they automatically are now more guided towards towards the good,
the right thing.
True, and the beautiful, right?
Right. Totally.
Yeah, I definitely have to look into the differences, the nuances between Storge and agape. I don't think I have them nailed yet, but
we could say that like Storge is right, that love that tells your child not to touch the hot stove, whereas agapic love is that parental love that makes your child want to be more than you ever could have been.
What's the love where you allow the child to touch the hot stove just so that you know not to do that in the future?
Well, maybe you have them right, put their hand through a candle briefly rather than grabbing the stove.
That's probably a bit smarter.
Teach them what heat is without having them sear their flesh.
Well, I know sometimes, like when they're fighting, I will intervene, but other times I will deliberately just step back and say, "You guys need to work this out." Mm-hmm. So it's sometimes about balance. Sometimes I'm just going to say, "This is the way we should be," and then sometimes I try to let them experience the downside. And for example, if one of them smacks the other and they get hit back, and then they come to me. I say, well, what do you expect to happen when you smacked him? Like, you did this first. So it's other, but I don't know, maybe it's inconsistent, but I'm just trying to sometimes give different messages. Sometimes message of learn from what you've done. What did you expect to happen? And then sometimes I'll just be like to the other kid, well, just because he did it doesn't mean you do it back. So I don't know.
Yeah. I really got to read Jean Piaget's work with the child psychology, because I know he kind of like lays out what are the I guess levels or the different ways in which children think about like ethics and morality. Like there's one form where like, okay, these are the rules that we have to hold to, and then there's kind of the next step from that. Okay, like we're able to kind of adjust these rules, and then from there, like we can kind of create new rules from there as well. But I'm not sure the exact layout it has, but it's it'd be something well worth looking into, I think, for myself. There's something that Vervaeke sort of brought up. He like leveled a bit of a criticism to William James that I kind of wanted to push back a little bit, just in case I can. I know he kind of said that he was a fan of William James, like very much a psychologist, very much interested in the like religious study and like how people undergo change and transformations. But he leveled a sort of a criticism of William James' philosophy of pragmatism, that he thinks that for the pragmatists, they sometimes confuse relevancy with truth. And I'm sure he'd bring up that is a way in which we can undergo self-deception in a sort of way, where if we're like getting rid of the truth in order to stick with what's relevant, that's a mild form, I guess, of bullshitting. And I'm sort of extrapolating, based on guessing what he's kind of making a point there, since it was basically a throwaway comment, but I wanted to kind of at least lay out that within pragmatism, it's not that like pragmatism leaves off truth in order to go with relevancy only, but it sees relevancy and truth as one and the same thing. Like there's a direct quote from, I think, Pragmatism, like when questioned, like, why is the truth good? And like, well, the answer is, well, because it's useful. And then when there's some sort of question like, okay, why is this thing useful? Well, because it's good. Or no, because it's true. Like the reason something is useful is because there's some sort of element to truth there within it. And it's a way sort of like cycling back onto itself. But I think that's very much like the pragmatist philosophy, is what is true is equivalent to what is useful. And from there,
Right.
you can kind of work your way around that.
But what is useful can be false. So
well, it still contains some amount of truth within it. So like looking at this from a Darwinian, our beliefs are like material things in a sense. They're things that exist within brains, and we exist as organisms. And these beliefs are helpful to us in like fulfilling our biological imperative of just existing, survival. That's sort of the thing there. And so if we try to think about our beliefs outside of that, we're kind of disembodying our beliefs from ourselves. And that's where we can fall victim to holding to true beliefs that will just get into getting us killed, because we didn't know how to apply those true beliefs to our own embodied practice of them. Like we have certain beliefs that are true, but we don't have any sort of connection to how relevant to us and how can we apply these things into practice, because that kind of thing exists just without any sort of proposition holder. They just exist as facts independent of like what we're supposed to, how we're supposed to use them. That's kind of like the whole is ought gap that's there. But yeah, it was kind of I don't know. There's, for one, I'm not sure exactly how he's meaning true, because earlier in the things he's talked about, he seems to be sort of a follower of Kant, where we don't really have access to what is true. All we have access to are the constraints of our own thinking, our own cognition. We're stuck behind this veil.
Is that what he means by mixing up truth for relevant? That what we're really concerned about is what is relevant more than what is true?
Well, the critique he was leveling towards pragmatism was that they're merging truth and relevancy or they're confusing truth with relevancy. Like just because something's relevant, that makes it true to the pragmatist. Whereas for Vervaeke, no, there's a clear distinction. There's probably the correspondence theory of truth or something like that.
I mean, it's sort of like the same critique I have of Jordan Peterson, like in this debate with Sam Harris.
Yeah,
where
I was going to say it was that Sam Harris Jordan Peterson debate that drove everyone crazy. Go ahead.
And I get the point. I get the point Peterson is making. I just don't know why we should use the word truth there. It just seems usefulness is just as good as truth, or it seems better than truth there. To say that something can be technically untrue but still very useful, that's a perfectly fine way of saying it. I don't know why we then have to say, well, because it's useful, let's just call it truth. It just seems to be, I don't like merging definitions unnecessarily. And it seems to be just wanting to use the word truth when we don't have to. Like, it's not bad to say myths are true in a different way than other things are true. That they're conveying a pattern that's true versus saying they're literally true. Like, we can have different types of
right, and you can also be precise, because that particular debate was frustrating because of that. The point where it's really, you can be really accurate, is that in order for something to be useful, there generally has to be some truth content in there, or it shouldn't or won't be useful. So there's got to be some relationship to truth in order for it to be truly have utility. But the conflation of truth and utility is not always true. It doesn't always hold. So, you know, you can be really precise about it. And Jordan Peterson was kind of being, I don't know, that debate drove me up the wall. I thought that was it was like the most infuriating.
I mean, not even utility
it was like Chinese water torture.
Even with utility, we can't make like, for some reason we are also treating utility as easier to judge than truth, and I don't think that's true either. Right? Something that is useful in a moment could actually prove to be extremely damaging at a later point. So we don't get to make blanket statements of utility, much like we don't get to make blanket statements of truth. So I don't know, there's so much fuzz in here. And it seems just like we keep shifting the word to try and find a word that is true in all instances. And it just doesn't work whenever we try and make that move, regardless of what we call it or how we change the parameter.
Yeah, I would say that's sort of the limitation to our current conception of truth, that it has this like very specific, almost binary property to it. Like either a proposition is either true or it's not true, in which case it's false. But there's certain things, such as principles, that aren't going to be true in every single circumstance. In fact, it has to be it has to have some sort of dynamic component to it so that it can evolve given the certain context that it's within. But it's still mostly true, is where it's highly applicable to most circumstances. Like be skeptical of things you read online. That's sort of like a generalized statement, but it's not like binarily true.
Treat every gun as if it's loaded.
It's a truism.
It's the rules of thumb. And again, I think maybe truth is the wrong word. We got into this about morality.
Right.
Is a moral claim true? And I say, well, no, a moral claim is good or bad, not true. And so by good meaning has a positive effect for us, and bad meaning has a negative effect for us. And you know, same with these rules of thumb. We could say what it means is it's more often than not, all things being equal, this is a good default. You know, this is a good default thing. It doesn't mean it's true, because there's going to be lots of cases where, you know, it's pretty bad to treat a gun as if it's, you know, there may be times where it's bad to treat a gun as if it's loaded. You know, for example,
if someone's trying to shoot you and you're treating your gun as if it's loaded and it isn't,
you better check. So, you know, like I don't think we need to use the word true everywhere. We just seem to want to use the word true, I think, in a lot of places, because it gives it this
higher authority.
This mark of this check mark, I guess. It's the blue check mark of philosophy.
Well, and maybe that's sort of the thing, is like, if most of our principles, like we can't attribute any sort of truth value to them, then it kind of like leaves us very much empty without having anything to like have in its place. And so if we can have like recognizing that truth from the pragmatist perspective isn't going to be universally true. It's only true within this specific context, and it's fallible and liable to be reupholstered by some further truth down the line. Kind of like the way science is. It's like and it's kind of funny, because Vervaeke went into this with like, how do we understand understanding? Like, what is it? Like, how can we say that somebody understands something? And if we're directly connecting to it of like, they know what the truth is behind that, then it would be the case that most people all throughout history didn't understand anything. When that seems kind of like to say that Newton didn't understand gravity just because like our new theory of gravity has things that his theory didn't have. That seems kind of wrong, because like Newton very much did at least have a very strong grasp of gravity. And so like his workaround is the way that he sort of like rethinks about understanding is the alignment of those four having a propositional understanding, a procedural understanding, a perspectival understanding, and a participatory understanding, all in alignment with one another. And that is when we can say that they understand the thing. And that doesn't require them having some sort of like Kantian or not even Kantian, but having some sort of like, I guess, Platonic understanding of the form of the truth behind that thing. It's just having these four components all in alignment with each other, which is, it's funny, it's still sort of Platonic, because that's kind of like what Plato is talking about, is like aligning all these different discombobulated aspects to yourself into a unified organism, and also unified in regards to other people as well. But being able to like have all of these four things together, that's understanding for him.
You know, it's interesting that our discussion about truth here really came down to relevance.
Yeah.
Like, so he's really he's onto something with this relevance. You know, we're looking, what are the, can't find a rule of truth that applies to every situation.
Right.
They're context sensitive, and yeah, what we're looking at is relevance realization. What is relevant in this situation?
And I think that's highly important, because like the way in which we arrive at like scientific truths or facts, things that are universally applicable propositionally to things out there, the way in which to get there is through the use of some sort of methodology or epistemology, which is very much relevancy realization. Okay, for this problem, I'm going to not accept all the other things that are irrelevant to this problem. Like if I'm trying to understand the biological mechanisms of evolution, I'm not going to be looking in the Bible in order to figure that out. That's irrelevant to the problem at hand. And so there's ways in which we go about learning truths. Yeah. And that's very much a relevancy realization practice that's going on there. So in order to even get at truth, you have to...
Guys, I gotta go.
First. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Greg, for joining us. This was fun.
Thanks, Greg. Good talking to you.
Thanks, Greg. We'll talk to you soon.
That was good. No, it's definitely isolating the phenomena is what is the deal. All right, guys. It was good. It was cool. I'm gonna
have a great night.
Yeah. And we'll probably wrap up pretty soon. I've only got like one or two more notes to sort of go through. I don't know.
I want to talk a little bit about the internalizing the sage.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get into.
Yeah. The
what were you going to say though, Nick? Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. If we're moving on, let's move on.
So he talked about some experiments where they gave so three different groups, and one group, so each with a condition. So one group, they had to solve a task where they were allowed to discuss it with someone else. A second group was supposed to imagine they were having an internal dialogue to discuss the problem solving task. And the third group was just told you're getting more time to think. And groups 1 and 2, so the ones where they discussed it with somebody else or imagined they discussed it with somebody else, performed better than groups 3. And more importantly, there was no major difference between groups 1 and 2. So talking about it with somebody else was just as good as imagining you were talking about it with somebody else. And that's really, really interesting. I mean, I know myself when I go through these lectures, when I do my little notes, that's sort of my talking to myself, right? And when I understand things better than the times where I'm doing it an hour before and I don't go through that process. And then we go through, we talk and then we start understanding it better. But that's really interesting that the internal dialogue is just as good as talking. So really we don't need, we should just have just film ourselves.
Okay, so here's what Brett would say at this point in time. He'd like push back on me, kind of conflating truth and utility here. So.
You hear that from writers all the time as well, right? Where the process of writing it out, and generally in order to be even somewhat of an effective writer, you have to imagine the audience to whom which you're writing.
Well, that's the whole point of having information. That's the whole point of having multiple characters in your story or whatever you're writing, is so that they can have these kind of like differing perspectives and then kind of work it out between themselves. So like this character, he would act in this certain way, and then that would have this sort of other ramification to the other system that's going on here. And they're like having a dialogue there.
So once again, Socrates was on point.
I know. Yeah. He's like, he's definitely onto something.
And then the Solomon effect, which is that if you describe the problem to you from the first perspective, you tend to get locked in. Whereas if you describe your problem from the third person perspective, you can open the door for more insight. And this is also part of what I say is when you're in a conversation, put yourself in the other person's shoes. Try to see it whenever you're in a discussion, an argument, try to see it from the other person's perspective. And that can really help open up how you think about their position.
But it's kind of nice having the two subjects there, because you can have your first person perspective and your third person perspective, and you're not falling victim to the problems that you would have if you had just the one or the other. Because like you could say like the Buddhist method of resolving your problems is to stepping outside of them and like looking at them from a third person perspective, to the point that they no longer have the hypersalience to them.
Yeah, I wonder if it works the other way around. If somebody tells you a problem in the third person perspective, if you translate into the first person
to try to get like their like have some sort of first person empathetic response to their problem from the that'd be interesting. That would be like a weird inversion.
Give terrible advice. I mean, I've had that happen where like I overly empathize with the situation someone was dealing with, and then I literally get angry at like the person I never met that they're telling a story about.
Oh man.
You know, someone cut me off and they did this and this and this, and then I just get like upset and, you know, oh, you should have punched him in the face, you know.
Yeah, that's really fascinating though, that just by going through the practice of like imagining yourself talking to somebody else, that can be a beneficial use of insight or mechanism for insight, I guess you could say. Which I don't know about you, but kind of gives me a new profound appreciation for religious prayer in an actual like dialogical sense.
That's an interesting point.
Well, I've always thought, I don't know if I've always thought it, but I've at least recently thought it, that prayer is very akin to meditation and has a lot of the, like Craig gone here, but he talks about going into his prayer closet, and he'll go in for half an hour, and I'll bet you anything, it's the brain processes that are going on. If you connected the electrodes, would be very similar to what somebody doing mindfulness meditation would be going through.
But I think both
contemplative meditation. Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just I don't know how much of a difference it really is there, but at least with the internalization of the sage that you're communicating with, you're able to deal with the problems from these sort of two different perspectives. Whereas from the mindfulness of meditation, you can kind of step outside your problems and get a new perspective on it for sure. But it's
there's also the contemplative
perspective.
There's also the contemplative perspective type of meditation, which honestly I don't know a lot about. I've just heard people talking about it, but I've never done it. So I'm guessing that's more the third person type.
Yeah,
but I don't know. Sorry,
jhana yoga. Yeah,
but
I was
go ahead.
To that point, I was going to toss in just both the words prayer and meditation are so fudgy that we really have no idea what the person's doing unless they explicitly tell us what it is they consider to be prayer or meditation, right? There's thousands of different kinds of meditation if you really wanted to go into it. And I would assume that is exactly the same with prayer. Right? I've heard it described as the process of opening oneself up towards agapic love. So that would be much more like a type of mindfulness meditation where you're trying to empty the mind, make room, except now it's directed towards allowing something in. Also, it's not just emptiness, it's emptiness to be filled. and then the
Could also
process of
just be like-
communicating with God through prayer is very much the kind of jhana yoga, contemplation meditation.
Do you know about that? Can you just give a little description of what contemplation meditation is, if you know about it?
Again, it's a pretty huge it's a big catch-all. Perhaps it would be more useful, right? There's the 8 branches of yoga,
but does it
jhana
have
yoga
that?
is specifically mind work, so
Does it-
philosophy is
Does it still have that, I guess, personal component to it, that similar to like where you're having a conversation between you and
we
another
could
person?
consider a Socratic dialogue to be absolutely a form of
Okay.
contemplation meditation.
Mhm.
That's what it is. Yeah.
So like I have a problem, and then I ask myself, okay, why do I have that problem? Why is this even a problem? And then like I give an answer, and then sort of ask myself some other thing. That would be sort of like John. Okay.
You could do it in that first person where you're in some sense dialoguing with yourself. You could do it literally in the sense of a Socratic dialogue where you are chatting with an imaginary other persona, right? You could do it in so many different ways. It's just that it's generally directed towards a certain set of outcomes. You're doing it for a specific reason. That's really the only thing that is
I think this will be something that I'd want to see a lot more from Vervaeke, is his expansion on this idea of serious play, and actually actually developing it into some sort of practice that you can help with people. Because I think there is a lot to that is severely underrepresented within probably most religions. That's a generalization, but at least underrepresented within the religions of the West, or that maybe Buddhism, secular Buddhism, would be able to sort of provide some sort of insight to people.
I'd say Hinduism, if anything. Buddhism's pretty limited in the range of its various practices. It's kind of like, in some sense, a really intense curation of Hindu practices. But if you look into Hinduism, I mean, it is by far the most massive philosophically of the religions of the world. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's endless. It seems like they thought of literally everything.
Plus,
but yeah, we often don't get you don't hear it. You just kind of get the Bhagavad Gita, which is in some ways it's like saying that the entirety of Christianity is just the Gospel of Mark or whatever. Wow. It's a massive simplification of what's going on there.
And I don't know, at least for myself, I might be more open to the Hinduistic practices. For one, I think it has a bit more longevity to it than Buddhism, but I don't know, I may be wrong with that. But the other thing is that I'm partially, I guess, skeptical to Buddhism, in that I think its underlying metaphysic is nihilistic. Whereas I don't think within Hinduism you kind of had that same thing. I think it's like
Hinduism is Gnostic, a Gnostic basis, and very clearly so.
Like everything is God in a sense. Like, sure, I think there is still sort of the rejection of the ego within Hinduism as well, but it's still like a subcomponent to the greater God.
Yeah,
but I don't know. I'm kind of.
In the Rig Veda, you've got.
I'm kind of talking out of my ass.
In the Rig Veda, you've got the identity where Atman and Brahman are revealed to be the same thing, and that's kind of the central,
and the Atman
very
is
most
the
central
self.
core of Hinduism. Atman is the self.
Right. Brahman
is the God beyond all gods, the totally unspeakable, unknowable God. So not Brahma, Shiva, or Vishnu. Those are subdivisions of Brahman.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But yeah, that's why I would characterize it as fundamentally Gnostic.
And I guess there are certain elements of Gnosticism that can lead to nihilism. But given the longevity to Hinduism, that's the other thing that allows me to suspect that it's not ultimately nihilistic at its core. And
Yeah.
that should probably also be a reason to not dismiss Buddhism as much either, because I know still within Buddhism you have the notion of reincarnation, and so it's not total annihilation, at least not yet. It has to go
the
through
realization of
several processes before you
enlightenment
get to there.
is supposed to be one of a kind of pseudo annihilationism. Right. Pseudo just because it's not actually ever perfectly clearly stated what happens. All you know is that you exit the cycle of death and rebirth. Whether that's into an oceanic god-like being, or whether it is into nothingness, or whether nothingness is the godlike being, or right, how that all works is left totally
It's all a mystery. Yeah. But that's pretty much I think all my notes really. There's one thing, but I don't know. Did you want to say something, Brett?
No, I have a kid who's still awake who I have to get down, so I don't mind drawing this to an early close.
Okay.
As I do.
Yeah, that's probably good.
My parental agapic and Storge.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. All right. So thanks everybody for watching. We have the links down below to Brett's notes, as well as our link to our Discord and the Vervaeke's lectures. If you,
I just see Concept had just joined us in the chat. Good timing, Concept. We're ending.
You missed it, Concept. But yeah, I'm excited. Like, there's just 5 lectures left now to his whole series. It'll be like what, 2, maybe 3 more discussions between us. I don't know what we'll do.
Next lecture is entitled Conclusion. So that has to be that big things. We have to expect big things from that. I'm sure he's not going to let us down.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to his episode. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, looking forward to that. You better not let us down, Vervaeke. We already put in how many hours to this?
That's right. We're 45 episodes in. We're invested now.
Yeah, 45 hours just watching, and then like 5, I don't know, 3 or 4 times that discussing.
Yeah. Exactly.
It better be good. We revolt otherwise. All right, so thanks everybody for joining in. Join us in the Discord and hang out with us, and hopefully discuss further lectures with us coming up. So thanks also to Craig who joined us, and also Nick and Brett and myself. Bye guys.
All right, thanks everyone.